Coventry, England. The Daimler works. A vehicle rolls out that barely looks like a weapon of war at all. It is small, almost comically small. Less than 4 tons, 2 men inside, sitting so close they can touch shoulders. No big gun, no turret on the early versions. Just a single machine gun and a welded steel box on 4 wheels, barely taller than the men who would crew it. Standing next to a battle tank, it looked like a toy that had wandered onto the wrong parade ground. Officers who wanted firepower were unimpressed. A scout car with 1 machine gun seemed like an afterthought, a vehicle for carrying messages and little else. Critics noted it could be destroyed by any real anti-tank weapon, that its armor would stop rifle fire and almost nothing heavier. They said 2 men in a tin box had no business anywhere near a modern battlefield. Every one of those observations was technically correct, and every one of them completely missed what this little machine was actually for. That 4-ton scout car would fight in the Suez Crisis. It would patrol the mountains of Aden and the jungles of Malaya. It would serve with United Nations peacekeepers in the Congo. It would deploy to Cyprus, to Borneo, to the Rhodesian bush. It would patrol the streets of Northern Ireland for nearly 40 years. It would fight in the Gulf War, the Lebanese Civil War, the Sri Lankan Civil War, and conflicts on 5 continents, more than 30 separate wars. And in 2022, 70 years after the first one left the Daimler factory, examples of this same little vehicle were documented in service in the war in Ukraine. Its designation was the Ferret, powered, like the larger Saladin that would follow it, by a Rolls-Royce engine, and it became the most widely travelled and longest-serving British armoured vehicle of the entire Cold War. To understand why the Ferret existed, you need to understand what the British Army learned in the Second World War. Throughout that conflict, the Army had relied on small scout cars for reconnaissance, liaison, and command duties. The Daimler Dingo, a tiny 2-man scout car, had proven invaluable. It could move fast, hide easily, carry a commander forward to see the ground for himself, and slip away before the enemy could react. The lesson the war taught was simple. On a battlefield dominated by tanks and artillery, there was an enormous and permanent need for a small, fast, quiet vehicle whose job was not to fight, but to see, to report, and to survive long enough to bring the information back. The men who fought the great armoured battles of the war understood something the planners sometimes forgot. A tank that does not know where the enemy is will die before it fires a shot. Reconnaissance was not a secondary task. It was the thing that kept everything else alive. In 1949, the British Army issued a requirement for a replacement for its wartime scout cars. Daimler, which had built the successful Dingo, was the natural choice. The result, designed in 1950 and entering production in 1952, was the Ferret. It was an evolution of the Dingo concept, modernized and enlarged, but built around the same philosophy: small, fast, reliable, and survivable. The design brief was demanding in its simplicity. The vehicle had to be cheap enough to build in large numbers, simple enough for a regimental mechanic to maintain in the field, and tough enough to survive years of hard use in any climate on Earth. There would be no factory specialists in the desert. Whatever broke had to be fixable by the men who drove it. The vehicle that emerged was a masterpiece of compact engineering. 3.7 tons combat-loaded, 3.7 meters in length, less than 2 meters wide, and less than 2 meters tall. A crew of 2 in the most common version. Commander and driver, sitting in an all-welded monocoque steel hull with a boat-shaped lower profile and sloped sides. That hull shape was not an accident. The sloped, rounded lower hull was designed to deflect rounds and, as crews would later discover in mine-heavy conflicts, to help shed the blast of an explosion outward rather than straight up into the crew compartment. The armor was thin, between 6 and 16 millimeters, enough to stop rifle and machine gun fire and shell splinters, but no more. That was a deliberate trade. Every kilogram of armor not fitted was a kilogram that went into speed, range, and the ability to go places heavier vehicles could not. The engine was a Rolls-Royce B60 inline 6-cylinder petrol unit producing 130 horsepower, the same Rolls-Royce B-series engine family that would power the larger Saladin armoured car. Putting 130 horsepower into less than 4 tons gave the Ferret a road speed of 93 kilometers per hour, 58 miles per hour, and the ability to cross country at speeds that left heavier armor far behind. All 4 wheels were driven. The suspension was fully independent. Operational range reached 310 kilometers. Many versions were semi-amphibious or could be fitted with a flotation screen for crossing water. The driver sat forward, low in the hull, with the engine behind him, and the fighting compartment in the center and rear. The armament was modest. A single machine gun, either a 7.62mm general-purpose machine gun or an older 30 caliber Browning. Some later Marks carried a small turret. Some carried swing-fire anti-tank guided missiles, turning the little scout car into a surprisingly dangerous tank killer. Across more than 60 distinct marks and variants, the Ferret was adapted to almost every role a light armored vehicle could perform. There were command versions with extra radios, ambulance versions, and versions with raised roofs for liaison work. The basic vehicle was so sound that it could be bent to almost any purpose an army required. Now, before we get into where this vehicle actually fought across 7 decades and 3 dozen conflicts, if you are finding this deep dive worthwhile, hit subscribe. It costs nothing, and it keeps this channel producing content at this depth. The Ferret's combat career began almost immediately, and never really stopped. In the Malayan emergency, Ferrets escorted convoys and patrolled jungle roads against communist insurgents, their speed and small size letting them move through terrain where larger vehicles struggled. The narrow plantation tracks and tight jungle roads of Malaya would have trapped a heavier armored car. The Ferret slipped through them, fast and quiet, exactly as designed. The threat in Malaya was the ambush. A convoy moving through dense jungle could be hit from a few meters away with no warning. The Ferret's job was to lead, to draw the first fire, and to put its machine gun on the source of it long enough for the convoy to react. It was dangerous work, and the small armored box saved the lives of the men inside it again and again. In the 1956 Korea's crisis, British Ferrets came ashore as part of the Anglo-French intervention, operating in the streets and along the canal. The vehicle's compact dimensions made it ideal for urban movement where a larger armoured car would have been trapped and vulnerable. In the close streets of Port Said, where every window and rooftop could hide a gunman, a vehicle that could turn in a narrow alley and reverse out of trouble at speed was worth more than one with a bigger gun and no room to use it. In 1955, the lifeguards were flown into the Aden Protectorate with their Ferrets, an early demonstration of exactly the kind of rapid air deployable capability the Army had wanted. A vehicle small and light enough to be flown into a crisis zone and operational the moment it rolled off the aircraft. In an age before heavy strategic airlift was common, that was a rare and valuable quality. During the Long Aden emergency from 1963 to 1967, Ferrets operated throughout the Radfan Mountains, protecting RAF installations and supporting British forces against insurgents in some of the harshest terrain and hottest temperatures any vehicle could face. The Rolls-Royce engine and the simple rugged drivetrain kept them running where the heat and dust killed more delicate machinery. A vehicle that breaks down in the desert is worse than no vehicle at all. The Ferret did not break down. One of the Ferret's most distinctive roles came in the service of the United Nations. In 1962, 12 new Ferret Mark IIs were provided to Irish peacekeepers, serving with the United Nations operation in the Congo. In the chaos of the Congo crisis, these little British scout cars, crewed by Irish soldiers under a UN flag, provided exactly the kind of mobile, protected presence that peacekeeping in a collapsing state demanded. The image captures something essential about the Ferret. It was not a vehicle built for one army or one war. It was a tool so fundamentally useful that it ended up everywhere, in every kind of conflict, under every kind of flag. The Ferret's single longest deployment was Northern Ireland. From the beginning of Operation Banner in 1969, Ferrets patrolled the streets and country roads of the province. In an environment where the threat was the sniper, the ambush, and the roadside bomb rather than the enemy tank, the Ferret's combination of small size, protection against small arms, and high speed made it genuinely valuable. It could move through narrow streets a larger vehicle could not, present a small target, and accelerate out of a killing zone faster than almost anything else on wheels. Ferrets served in Northern Ireland, across decades of the Troubles, one of the longest continuous operational deployments of any British armoured vehicle. The vehicle designed in 1950 to scout for tank armies in Germany found a second life patrolling the streets of Belfast and the country lanes of Armagh, and in the harsh mine warfare environment, crews learned a lesson the original designers had stumbled into by accident. That boat-shaped, sloped lower hull, designed in 1950 to deflect bullets, also helped deflect the blast of mines. Crews sometimes removed the external stowage bins in mine-prone areas, having learned that anything that trapped or channeled a blast was a liability. The Ferret was not designed as a mine-protected vehicle, but its shape gave it a measure of protection that more angular designs lacked. It was an advantage the designers never planned for, discovered by the men who actually had to drive over the threat. The export record is where the Ferret's true scale becomes clear. More than 4,400 were built between 1952 and 1971. They were sold to and operated by more than 30 nations across every inhabited continent: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, which still operated them decades later, Pakistan, Malaysia, Singapore, which developed its own version, France, which used them during the Algerian War, South Africa and Rhodesia, where they fought in the bush wars of southern Africa, Portugal, in its colonial wars, Jordan, which developed its own modernized version, Lebanon, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Sudan, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, Myanmar, Nepal, the Philippines, and more. Wherever an army needed a cheap, simple, reliable vehicle to scout ahead, escort a convoy, or show armored presence on a tense border, the Ferret was there. It asked little and delivered much. The full list of conflicts the Ferret participated in reads like a catalogue of the second half of the 20th century. The Malayan Emergency, the Cyprus Emergency, the Algerian War, the Suez Crisis, the Sudanese Civil Wars, the Aden Emergency, the Rhodesian Bush War, the Portuguese Colonial War, the Nigerian Civil War, the Cambodian Civil War, Black September in Jordan, the Troubles, the Dhofar Rebellion, the Lebanese Civil War, the South African Border War, the Uganda-Tanzania War, the Iran-Iraq War, the Sri Lankan Civil War, the Gulf War, the Somali Civil War, and, remarkably, the war in Ukraine, where ferrets have been documented in service following the Russian invasion, more than 30 wars across 7 decades. Few weapons in the history of warfare have witnessed so much of it. On paper, the Ferret's contemporaries and successors offered more in almost every category. The Soviet BRDM series was larger, faster on roads, fully amphibious, and more heavily armed. The American MEM-114 was a tracked reconnaissance vehicle, with more internal space. Later British vehicles like the Scorpion and the Scimitar carried real cannon and offered far greater firepower. By the standards of any single specification, the little Ferret was outclassed by almost everything that came after it. And yet none of those vehicles matched what the Ferret actually achieved. None of them served in as many nations. None of them fought in as many wars. None of them stayed in service for as many decades. The BRDM was a fine reconnaissance vehicle, but it was a product of one block for one kind of war. The M114T was quietly withdrawn after disappointing service. The Ferret was something rarer. This is the difference between what looks good on a specification sheet and what actually works in the hands of soldiers. A bigger gun is useless if the vehicle carrying it cannot get down the road. Heavier armor is worthless if the engine that has to haul it gives out in the heat. The Ferret made none of those mistakes. It did exactly what was asked, and it kept doing it. A vehicle so simple, so reliable, so genuinely useful for the universal task of reconnaissance, that armies of every description, on every continent, in every kind of conflict, found a use for it, and kept finding uses for it, for 70 years. The British Army finally retired its Ferrets from frontline service in the early 1990s, replacing them with the Scimitar and Sabre, but the vehicle refused to disappear. Some operators kept them running into the 21st century. Collectors prized them for their affordable price and the vast supply of spare parts that 70 years and 4,400 vehicles had left scattered around the world. And on the battlefields of Ukraine, 3/4 of a century after the first one rolled out of the Daimler works in Coventry, the little scout car was documented still doing the job it was built for. 1952. A Coventry factory built a 4-ton scout car with 1 machine gun, 2 crewmen, and a Rolls-Royce engine. The officers wanted more firepower. The critics noted its armor would stop nothing serious. They said 2 men in a tin box had no place on a modern battlefield. And then that tin box went to Suez, to Aden, to the Congo, to Cyprus, to Borneo, to Rhodesia, to Northern Ireland for 40 years, to the Gulf, to Lebanon, to Sri Lanka, to more than 30 wars across 5 continents and 7 decades, all the way to Ukraine in 20. More than 4,400 built. More than 30 nations. The smallest, lightest, most lightly armed British armoured vehicle of the Cold War turned out to be the one that went everywhere, served everyone, and outlasted nearly everything built to replace it. The critics measured it against the gun it did not carry, and the armour it did not have. They never measured it against the thing that actually mattered, which was the number of wars it would quietly, reliably survive. That is not luck. That is what happens when a vehicle is built to do one job perfectly, instead of every job adequately,